When I came to, I realized I was sitting in a large elliptical room. A huge workstation took up half the space. In the center, a screen projected all kinds of data. On either side of the screen, there were large control panels with switches, buttons, small screens, knobs, and other instruments. I could see at least 10 aliens hunched over, concentrating on their tasks. About 20 feet away from them, I saw a large swivel chair in the center that looked like the entire operation. Someone was sitting on it. His back was turned to me. When I tried to get up, I realized I was immobilized in a chair. My waist, wrists, and legs were bound in handcuffs. I looked for Baxter and found him, asleep in a corner. Before I could call out to him, I heard a voice say, "Hello, Michael. Welcome aboard." The person in the swivel chair turned around to face me. It was the same alien I had first seen with the telescope. It was over 2.5 meters tall. It had an elongated jaw and a bulbous head. It stuck out backwards instead of a nose. It had a triangular slit, but the most striking thing was its eye. It only had one placed vertically in the center of its forehead. It seemed older than the other members of its crew, and it was evident that he was in command. "How do you know my name?" I asked. The alien smiled and replied, "Humans love to put all their data into the ether, from government records to social networks. Everything seems to be a click away." Although he spoke in his native language, an artificial intelligence program translated his words into English. He wore a tunic with the logo of a bright sun and an eye in the center. I knew I had seen that emblem before, and suddenly I remembered the telescope. I quietly pronounced the word Corello, but he heard it. "That's right. I am Captain Corello, and the telescope that you found belonged to me." Then he continued, "I come from the planet ZX4. The telescope was my gift to the former president when I first visited Earth in 1969. In fact, I have visited Earth many times over the decades. I never imagined that one day I would have it again in my hands." He pointed to the telescope they had recovered from me and which now sat on his desk. "So you are a diplomat. You are here representing the government of your planet?" I asked him. "I am not a private contractor. I come regularly to get to know the land, study your species, analyze your society, evaluate how they function as a collective unit, and follow their scientific and technological advances. It is an essential part of my job. So when I finally get the light, I will be prepared green light for what I asked him to colonize your planet and take over its resources." Of course, I stared at him in silence. Corello continued, "You see, Michael, even in my part of the universe, politics is an inevitable aspect of life. As societies advance, the masses begin to become aware. They become more vocal about individual rights, liberty, the right to subsistence, and the like. But it is a convenient awareness. They are always willing to look the other way, as long as they are not directly accused of being the aggressors. However, the need for new lands and resources never stops on its own. When you have the ability terraforming any planet to replicate the conditions of your home, world colonizing is easier than trying to repair and maintain what you already have. It also reduces internal conflicts because people can move to new territories and start over. But someone has to do the colonization work, and the government doesn't want to get their hands dirty, so they outsource these tasks to people like me. This allows them to deny their involvement, while I make a lot of money in the end. Everyone is satisfied. In fact, the Committee of Nations of my world, long ago, drew up a list with the order of colonization of the planets we extract, and use the resources of a planet before moving on to the next. The Earth already has the green light to be colonized. They think they can just get there with a few spaceships and take over our land and our people, assuming there will be no resistance from over 8 billion people. Would be a huge underestimation on their part. We may not have their technological superiority, but that doesn't mean we can't put up a fierce battle. We don't live in caves. We have nuclear capability. If we have to fall, you will fall with us. I added firmly. Captain Corellis let out a slight giggle. It has been more than a week since my arrival on Earth. I have already informed your government of my plans. The ultimatum has been given. But do you see any resistance on the ground? The average citizen continues going to work, picking up their children from school and kissing their partner before sleeping. So where is that supposed fight? Do you know why not? All the important defense systems can already. They are under our control. The missiles don't fire. The fighters can't fly, the drones don't take off, and the nuclear bombs don't detonate. So how will you retaliate? Your people go to their rifles and start shooting in the sky. Plus the governments are already fleeing in terror. You know what happened in Russia? Accident. The Russian government tried to challenge me. So detonating one of their bombs, it was a clear message to the others. And now, I have your full cooperation. Corello let the silence reign for a moment, allowing his words to sink in, and then continued only, I decide what happens to your planet and its people. Neither you nor your government can do anything about it. Now I fully control all your defense systems. Only commercial flights remain in the air, and they are being constantly monitored. This is solely to maintain secrecy and avoid panic among the public. But even that will end tonight. What will happen tonight? Cleaning. What do you mean? I asked. When I visited Earth in the 90s, I was invited on a hunting trip by the then Prime Australian Minister. We shoot and kill kangaroos for fun. Told me it was important to cull them to keep a manageable population. You see, Michael, when you work in my line of work, it is necessary. Learning to effectively handle the criticism that comes with wiping out an entire civilization is not, and it bothers everyone. But sacrificing, that is different. People don't object so much. Although it makes them a little uncomfortable, in fact, they even come to see it as a necessary evil. During my expeditions, I assign a piece of land to the local inhabitants and allow them to pre-select what they consider valuable for them. Almost always, civilizations choose the most essential to keep their societies running. Engineers, doctors, leaders, teachers, policemen, workers, and the like. But they are only allowed to select a few from each category. A selection of wild and domestic animals is also included to keep the habitat alive and exotic. And that is what will happen to you. Earthlings, in the next 24 hours, the human population will be reduced to 3% of what it is. Now special zones will be established for the survivors can bring their donkeys, goats, chickens, birds, insects, or anything else they deem important. The list of who or what should survive has been left to the discretion of each government. And the governments agree with this? I asked. Incredulously, he nodded. They have no choice. They are already working on it quietly, without the public knowing. How can you justify this as a sacrifice? It is a blatant genocide that borders on extermination. You say that concepts like the right to subsistence matter, even in your society, but you don't seem to be in the least perturbed by the idea of killing billions of people. I don't understand how they get away with it. If law and order have any weight in their world, I argued. Corello smiled and replied, Your problem is that you see us as equals. We are not. Neither I nor my people see it. So when kangaroos are killed, and it is called a selective slaughter, it is justified by saying that their overpopulation endangers natural resources. But the other reason is that their growing number is inconvenient for you. Their presence prevents you from enjoying the resources to live your life. The same way a large human population is not only an inconvenience, but also a threat to my people. If their numbers are high, humans will constantly feel displaced by having lost their land, which could embolden Theos to act against us. When the necessary is sacrificed, these problems disappear. They accept their fate quickly and even show compliance. Yet the indifference with which he spoke about ending so many lives, but his own people do not feel remorse when seeing photos or videos of corpses counted by billions. I asked, There will be no corpses. He answered calmly, What do you mean by that? I asked him, The people who do not make the cut will be vaporized. I felt anger build up. He sat there open-mouthed, unable to speak. Is that what you did with the scientists at the base? Vaporize Theos? I asked sarcastically. Corello simply nodded. I also ordered my people to leave the skeletal remains of your friend for security, as a message to your government. So do the same with my cousin, Henry. It's another message, right? I asked him. Yes, he replied naturally. My shoulders began to slump, as every fiber of my being vibrated with rage. I finally asked him, What am I doing here, Captain? Why am I not dead already? Corello watched me for a moment before saying, You remind me of myself. Michael, you're an agent of death. You may not know it or choose not to agree, but that is what you are. I am nothing like you, I replied. Corello snapped his fingers and digital copies of a police report appeared in front of me. It was related to the car accident that I was involved in when I was 9. You threw such a tantrum because your father wouldn't stop at your favorite ice cream shop that he eventually had to turn around to buy you what you wanted. The delay caused your family and your cousin's family to run into a drunk truck driver. I don't need to tell you the rest of the story. I was in shock. I had touched on a point I had never shared with anyone, except the policeman who questioned me after the accident. Not even my wife or my cousin Henry knew the truth. The guilt was too great to talk about, but Corello hadn't finished, continued. Your wife got cancer 2 years after they got married with you. Your cousin died Because ya brought my business to her door. Your friend El security guard, Joe, passed away because he was forced to cover your shift. Only God knows what else I might find out if I kept looking. I couldn't stand it anymore. I just wanted it to end. What are you going to do to me? I asked him. You're worth a lot of money, Michael. I'm going to sell you to a research group, specialized in studying people like you. They will analyze your blood, your DNA, and examine every corner of your brain to understand your life in detail, from the time you wake up to the types of dreams you have. They will study how you behave in different situations and your personal preferences. Then they will create clones from you to use as weapons in war strategies and espionage operations for the first time. I was laughing out loud. All that was so absurd that I couldn't help it. Captain, you give me too much credit. I may be unlucky, but to say that everything you mentioned is my fault is exaggerated. I am an ordinary man with an ordinary life. There are many like me. Corello smiled. That may be true, but no, I need you to be extraordinary. I just have to put you in the orbit of people capable of extraordinary things, and somehow, consciously or unconsciously, you will always find a way to end them. I stared at him. He was arrogant and thought I had understood everything. There was nothing I could say to change his perception from the beginning, had not sat well with me. But now I despised him deeply. Meanwhile, Baster, my dog, had woken up and was sitting next to me, wagged his tail looking at me, which broke my heart. I knew my fate was sealed, but I didn't want him to suffer. Do you want me to spare your dog's life? Asked Corello with a smile. I looked at him without answering. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of asking him for anything, but my desperation was evident. Corello pressed a button on his armrest and a screen appeared in front of him. He typed some commands and slowly turned a control. Suddenly a strange sound filled the air. Derao immediately and ran around the room, clearly affected. He curled up in a corner, screaming in pain. I tried desperately to free myself, but my efforts were useless. Corello looked at us, enjoying the show. As he continued turning, the control Baster began to scream with greater intensity, and my helplessness to help him destroyed me inside. At that moment, I thought of Adam's little note. Was so desperate that I would try anything. I slid my pinky finger to the side, using the sharp edge of the armrest to create a wedge. Then I pulled hard, dislocating the finger. The pain was sharp, but I didn't care. I prayed for a miracle, something that would stop this nightmare, but suddenly Baster fell silent. Then to my horror, his body began to convulse, entering into a kind of epileptic attack. I looked up and saw Corello, who seemed as surprised as I was. However, his expression changed quickly. He went from surprise to shock, and then to absolute panic. He began to scream in desperation. No. As soon as he pronounced those words, the lights around the ship began to flicker. The first to turn off was the giant screen in front of us in a matter of seconds. The entire ship was plunged into complete darkness. The resulting silence was only interrupted by the screams of Corello, who gave instructions to his crew with a frantic tone and overflowing with panic. The energy returned. A few moments later, my heart sank as I saw Bater motionless on the ground. He had coughed up blood and his small body was lying in a pool of vomit. An intense anger took hold of me, growing with every second. I wanted to scream. I wanted to explode. I looked at Corello with fury, but he was too busy facing his own nightmare. His gaze was fixed on the outside, as if he had seen a ghost. I turned around to follow his line of sight, and then I saw him in the distance, floating in the air. There were two spaceships. They were now clearly visible, their silhouettes glowing faintly against the darkness of the sky. They were no longer hidden by any invisibility. Technology. You are responsible for this. What have you done? Shouted Corello, pointing at me with a finger. Sador, I sat stunned and completely bewildered. I had no idea what was going on around me. Look, that's what Corello said, pointing to the puddle left by Baster on the floor. That was when I saw it, for the first time in Baster's vomit. There was a small, shiny black ball that emitted a blue glow from within. Where did you get that from? He asked with suppressed fury, his voice shaking with disbelief. I stared back at him without understanding. Corello slumped in his chair. His shoulders slumped, his one eye. He was lost, absent, as if he was desperately trying to make sense of the situation. He seemed convinced that I was the one of his misfortune. As much as I enjoyed watching his desperation, I felt incredulous. How could he be blaming me? All I had done was lean back and break my finger. A subordinate interrupted his thoughts, informing him of a new and alarming development. 2 ballistic missiles had been launched from opposite directions, and they were heading towards the Corello ship. He immediately reacted, shouting orders to his crew. It was obvious that they were trying to prepare an evacuation, but something was not going well. The ship tried to take off, but barely managed to rise a few meters before falling back to its original position. What had happened to Baster seemed to have seriously affected the ship's technology. He did not understand how or why, but he could not look away. Corello shouted new orders, and soon a huge force shield surrounded the main ship. The 2 smallest ships of his fleet took off quickly, heading towards the missiles. At that moment, a familiar hum resonated in my ears. I looked at the sky and confirmed my suspicions. The fighters were back. 3 F-35s were advancing rapidly, their engines roaring as they approached the target. They probably came from the airfield near the base. One of Corello's ships turned and prepared to face them, although the F-35s are fast and maneuverable. Corello's spaceships were from another level. They looked gigantic in comparison, and moved with a speed that defied all logic, at least 30 times faster. The spaceship closed the distance in the blink of an eye, and fired at the first F-35. The pilot barely had time to react before his plane exploded in a ball of fire. The other 2 Gazas tried to respond by launching missiles in its direction, but the ship skillfully dodged each attack. Then in an unexpected movement it turned in the air and placed itself between the 2 F-35s, firing simultaneously. At both within seconds, the 3 fighters were engulfed in flames and spiraling towards the ground. Meanwhile, the other spaceship had already destroyed one of the ballistic missiles and was heading towards the second, reducing speed and gaining altitude. The ship positioned itself strategically, when the missile passed below it. The ship followed it, making a precise turn in the air to divert its trajectory. The missile seemed controlled by an invisible loop pulled by the ship from above, as it followed a steeply curved trajectory. By a moment I expected the missile to unexpectedly detonate and destroy the ship along with it. But to my disappointment it remained faithful to the course plotted by the spaceship. Like an obedient dog following orders, the ship suddenly slowed as it flew over a nearby city. The missile, unrestrained, plummeted toward the ground. An instant later, a colossal explosion lit up the horizon. Its target had been a vast electrical grid that was now crumbling in a tangle of flames and sparks. There was no doubt that Captain Corello was sending a clear and brutal message to my government. This is only the beginning if they persisted in defying him. Before I could process what had just happened, the screen in front of me changed to show a detailed map. 7 zones were marked in red, all distributed around Corello's main ship. It was evident that these areas marked nearby military bases or strategic airfields. The spaceships began to bombard these key points from height, dismantling any capability of quick response. Sporadic explosions lit up the map as the red zones became patches of chaos and destruction. After completing their attack, the 2 auxiliary ships returned to protect the mothership. Without wasting time, Corello gave new orders from its flanks. They released a series of cylindrical objects that fell gently into the air. Each cylinder was at least 15 met tall and 5 met wide. Curved metal rods emerged from its sides like huge antennas. The cylinders formed a ring around the mothership, slowly rotating clockwise. In a matter of seconds, the rods began to extend horizontally, connecting to each other until they created a bracelet-like structure that surrounded the ship. Corello. The scene was fascinating and terrifying. In equal parts, the auxiliary ships took position on the sides of the formation as a sentinel. They seemed prepared for something big. But what were they planning? What was about to happen? A growing anxiety took hold of me. The deep voice of Corello broke into my thoughts. Giving orders with precision, the crew began to deactivate several non-essential systems, reducing the ship to basic functions. The lighting went down, until leaving the room in darkness with a disturbing glow emanating from the screens on one of them. I observed how my government did not back off. A fleet of at least 20 fighter planes advanced from different directions, clearly determined to launch a massive attack. They came from bases further away, out of the immediate range of Corello, which gave them about 15 or 20 minutes to arrive. Meanwhile, the alien crew deployed a massive force shield that enveloped both the mothership and the auxiliary ships. Smaller ones began to move tracing orbits around the formation. Suddenly, both ships emitted energy. Aces similar to gigantic ropes of electricity that hit the metal bars connected to the cylinders. The energy vibrated intensely, as if the ship itself was charging for a monumental event. The sound was deafening, a mix of electrical snaps and a high-pitched hum that seemed to resonate in my bones. The activity was frenetic, almost chaotic, and the tension in the air was palpable. Looking at the scene from my seat, I could only wonder, would we survive? Could the ship withstand this energy overload without collapsing? Or would everything explode in an instant, destroying everything in its path? I looked at the Corello crew, only to observe their reaction. However, their gazes were fixed on the large screen in front of them. On it, a scoreboard was going up. They were slowly building an alternative energy source, and it seemed that their plan was working. So what would they do if they managed to reach maximum energy capacity? Would they launch an offensive, or would they simply... They would leave, I wondered. In the midst of that commotion, something suddenly caught my attention. I didn't know exactly what it was, but it happened very quickly. It was like a sudden flash of electricity in a remote corner of the room. I closed my eyes, trying to see better in that partially illuminated space, but I couldn't distinguish anything strange. It was probably just an electric arc generated by some equipment. The charging of the ships continued without interruptions for the next 10 or 15 minutes, while they continued to transmit an enormous amount of energy to the mother ship. The uncomfortable silence that reigned in the room was only broken when Corello's voice resonated through the speakers. I assumed he was reacting to the enemy aircraft that had approached his ship. There were at least 14, and they had already reached the limit of the force shield. Immediately, they opened fire, but the shield for the moment was holding firm. Resisting the coordinated attack, the rest of the fighters were also on their way, and would probably arrive in a few minutes. Then the same spark happened again. Electric appeared, and vanished in an instant, this time in the opposite corner of the room. I wondered if I was imagining things, or if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Music, however. It repeated itself this time, just 6 meters in front of me, accompanied by a crackling sound, and followed again by darkness. But this time, I managed to glimpse something, a brief flash that illuminated for an instant the silhouette of a familiar figure lurking in the gloom. It was Baster, I wondered, shocked, feeling how my skin crawled. I looked back to the place where I had seen him die. His body was still there, motionless on the floor. Then a loud crack resounded in the center of the room. The electric discharge became continuous and more intense with each passing second, and there he was, sitting upright. It was Baster without a doubt. But something about him was different. He no longer seemed made of flesh and bone. What I saw was rather a strange neon version of himself. All the electric discharge, what was happening around it, only added more depth to its form, illuminating it, and suddenly it vanished into the air with a soft pop. I looked nervously at Corello and the rest of his crew. They had also witnessed it, and the stunned and wary expressions on their faces left it. Of course. However, the awkward silence was suddenly broken by the urgent beeps emanating from the giant screen. The force shield was beginning to show signs of exhaustion after enduring constant attacks from aerial bombs, rockets, and cannon fire. It was evident that the enemy pilots were giving it their all, but the shield was still resisting the onslaught. Meanwhile, the remaining fighters were rapidly approaching their target to further aggravate the situation of Corello. I saw on the screen 2 new projectiles that by their trajectory I assumed were missiles launched by my own government. Meanwhile, the flashes of electric discharges continued to appear throughout the large oval room. In spite of this, the entire crew continued concentrated on their work, while Corello practically barked orders to his staff. Suddenly, one of the two smaller ships stopped emitting its beam and left the force shield, probably to create a distraction. The fighters launched themselves against it with all their strength. The ship was surrounded and outnumbered by fighters in all directions, receiving intense fire. As a retaliation, it fired indiscriminately at nearby fighters, managing to shoot down those who crossed its path. Although it suffered considerable damage in less than 5 minutes, it had shot down 14 fighters before falling engulfed in flames, which allowed Corello and his team to gain some time before the next assault. The other spaceship that continued to surround the mothership accelerated its movement and began to emit an even greater charge. At that moment, Corello turned his chair towards the center of the room to attend to a new internal problem. He said something through the intercom and typed a couple of commands on the console of his armrest. Suddenly, the whole room was bathed in an intense amber light. That amber light allowed me to see Baster clearly for the first time since his death. He looked at me with a mixture of strangeness and confusion, unable to understand his new ghostly form that looked like an astral projection floating around him. He ran from one side to the other, scared and disoriented, pursued by the electrical charges that harassed him like a shadow. Every time he slowed down, the electrical arcs increased in intensity, forcing him to keep moving to avoid the accumulation. I could see him howl and bark in fear. Although in that state, he did not emit any sound. Still, Baster kept a prudent distance from me, as if he were trying to protect me. At that moment, 3 aliens ran into the room wielding batons. I immediately recognized them as the same ones that had attacked Baster and my house. Henry surrounded Baster on all sides and began to approach him cautiously behind them. Another alien carried a glass dome-like object, large enough to enclose a dog. Baster looked at his captors with a defiant look, showing his fangs as they tried to invade his space. Yet without a physical body, he had little to defend himself with. He carefully backed away, taking a few steps back, until he was a couple of meters from a large operations console located just behind him. And then he did something beautiful, a gesture so natural to dogs that it seems an instinctive reaction to release anxiety, despite how harmless it was. At that moment, it made me smile for the first time in the last 2 miserable days.